Hey everyone! Before we dive into Mary's incredible story of betrayal and justice, I want to know, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment and let's see how far this story travels around the world. Now, imagine coming home to find your entire life packed up like garbage on a porch. That's exactly what happened to Mary, and what she did next will leave you speechless. The Arizona sun burned Mary's shoulders as she stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at her entire life scattered across the front porch like unwanted garage sale items. Her favorite blue armchair sat tilted against the railing, its fabric faded but still holding the impression of countless evenings spent reading. Cardboard boxes labeled Mary's stuff, in her daughter-in-law's sharp handwriting, were stacked carelessly next to her late husband's toolbox. The metal gleamed in the harsh afternoon light, a cruel reminder of promises broken and trust shattered. She clutched her purse tighter, feeling the weight of her house keys that no longer meant anything. A white envelope fluttered against the porch swing where she used to rock her grandson to sleep during his fussy nights. Mary's hands trembled as she walked up the steps she had climbed thousands of times, each footfall echoing like a countdown to the end of everything she thought she knew about family. The paper felt expensive between her fingers, nothing like the cheap notebooks she used to keep her bookstore records. Her reading glasses slipped down her nose as she unfolded the note, written in that same sharp handwriting that had labeled her possessions like inventory items waiting for disposal. "Thanks for everything, but we need the space," the words blurred together as tears filled her 69-year-old eyes. She read it again, slower this time, hoping the letters might rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something that didn't feel like a knife twisting in her chest. The signature at the bottom was just David and Claire. No love, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the 2 years she had given up her independence to live in their guest room. The guest room that apparently was needed for something more important than the woman who had raised David from scraped knees to college graduation. Mary sank onto the porch swing, the same swing where Claire used to complain about her mother-in-law's outdated stories and too much involvement in their lives. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She had made herself smaller and quieter over the months, hoping to become the kind of house guest they could tolerate. She had sold her beloved bookstore in Phoenix, the one she built from nothing after her husband died, just to help them with their mortgage when David lost his job. The money she made from 20 years of carefully curated books and loyal customers had disappeared into their bank account like water in desert sand. The front door remained closed, no faces appearing in the windows, no sounds of movement inside the house she had called home for 2 years. Mary stood slowly, her knees protesting after decades of standing behind bookstore counters, and began gathering the most essential items. Her grandmother's quilt, soft and worn from generations of love. The small wooden box containing her wedding ring and the pearl necklace Robert had given her for their 25th anniversary. A photo of her parents standing in front of their first home, sepia-toned and cracked but irreplaceable. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the lifetime of memories, would have to wait for whatever came next. 2 years earlier, Mary had been living her quiet dream in a cozy apartment above Chapters and Charm, her bookstore in downtown Phoenix. The morning light would filter through the large windows, casting golden rectangles across rows of carefully organized books that smelled of vanilla and old paper. She knew every customer by name and their reading preferences by heart. Mrs. Rodriguez loved historical romances, young Tommy preferred science fiction, and the lonely widower Mr. Chen came every Tuesday just to chat about mystery novels and drink the free coffee Mary always kept brewing. Her days followed a peaceful rhythm of opening at 8, recommending books until 6, then climbing the narrow staircase to her apartment where she would read until her eyes grew heavy. The call that changed everything came on a rainy Thursday in October. David's voice sounded strained through the phone, lacking the warmth it used to carry when he was younger, and would call every Sunday just to hear about her week. "Mom, we're in trouble," he said without preamble, and Mary could hear Claire's sharp voice in the background, though she couldn't make out the words. The mortgage company was threatening foreclosure, his marketing job had ended abruptly when the company downsized, and Claire's part-time work at the dental office wasn't enough to cover their expenses. Mary's heart ached hearing the defeat in her son's voice, the same voice that used to excitedly tell her about school projects and dreams of becoming a writer. Without hesitation, Mary offered to sell the bookstore and help them financially. The decision felt natural, motherly, the kind of sacrifice that good mothers make without expecting anything in return. She had raised David alone after Robert's heart attack took him too soon, working double shifts and weekend events to keep food on the table and clothes on his growing frame. The bookstore had been her sanctuary during those difficult years, a place where she could build something beautiful while processing her grief through the stories that lined her shelves. But David was her son, her only child, and his happiness mattered more than her own comfort. Claire's reaction to Mary moving in was polite but cold from the very beginning. She smiled tightly when Mary arrived with her essential belongings, showing her to the small guest room that felt more like a storage closet than a place where a person might live. The walls were beige and bare, with a single window that looked out onto the neighbors' garbage cans. Claire had already made it clear that Mary would need to respect their space and understand that married couples need privacy. The rules were never written down but were communicated through pursed lips and meaningful glances. No rearranging furniture, no cooking without permission, no having friends over, no playing music after 8 p.m. Mary tried to make herself useful by cooking meals, cleaning the house, and offering to watch her 2-year-old grandson Charlie while Claire worked. But every gesture of help was met with criticism disguised as suggestions. Her cooking was too heavy for their modern diet, her cleaning methods were outdated and potentially damaging to their expensive furniture, and her childcare style was too permissive for Charlie's developmental needs. Mary found herself apologizing constantly for taking up space, for breathing too loudly, for existing in a home where she had given everything to belong. The woman who once commanded respect from book publishers and literary event coordinators became a ghost in her own son's house. Mary learned to become invisible in increments, shrinking herself smaller each day until she barely cast a shadow in the hallways of the home her money had saved. She stopped joining them for dinner after Claire made too many comments about her old-fashioned table manners and unnecessary stories about the bookstore days. Instead, she ate quietly in her room, listening to the sounds of her family laughing and talking downstairs while she balanced a plate on her lap like a prisoner in her own purchased freedom. The guest room walls seemed to close in each evening as she stared at the ceiling, wondering how the woman who once hosted book clubs and literary discussions had become someone whose opinions were tolerated rather than valued. The transformation happened so gradually that Mary didn't notice how small she had become until she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror one morning. The confident woman who used to recommend life-changing novels to strangers had been replaced by someone who apologized for using too much hot water in the shower. Her shoulders curved inward now, as if trying to take up less space in the world. She spoke in whispers and moved like a guest overstaying her welcome, even though her financial contribution had literally kept the roof over their heads. The pearl necklace Robert gave her remained hidden in its wooden box because Claire once mentioned that flashy jewelry wasn't appropriate for someone Mary's age. Charlie was the only bright spot in Mary's increasingly gray existence, though even those moments of joy came with restrictions and criticism. When she would read him stories, changing her voice for different characters the way she used to captivate children during bookstore reading hours, Claire would interrupt to say that overstimulation wasn't good for his development. When Mary would build elaborate block castles with him on the living room floor, Claire would sweep in to explain that they were teaching him unrealistic expectations about what toys could do. The little boy's genuine delight in his grandmother's attention was constantly corrected and redirected, until even Charlie began to look uncertain when Mary offered to play. David seemed to exist in a bubble of willful ignorance, working long hours at his new job and coming home too tired to notice the tension crackling between his wife and mother. When Mary tried to talk to him about feeling unwelcome, he would pat her shoulder absently and suggest that women just need time to adjust to sharing space. He had become a stranger wearing her son's face, someone who could watch his mother fade away without asking why she had stopped humming while she cooked or why she never mentioned missing her bookstore anymore. The boy who once begged her to read just one more chapter had grown into a man who couldn't see that his mother was disappearing page by page. The final months felt like holding her breath underwater, waiting for permission to surface. Mary stopped offering opinions about household decisions, stopped suggesting family activities, stopped mentioning that she missed having conversations that lasted longer than requests to pass the salt. She became a paying ghost who haunted the corners of her son's life, wondering if the sacrifice of her independence had been worth watching her family treat her like an inconvenience they had to tolerate. The woman who once believed that love and sacrifice would earn her a place in her son's home learned that sometimes giving everything leaves you with nothing, not even the dignity of being seen. Robert had given Mary the pearl necklace on their 25th wedding anniversary, presenting it to her across the table at the same restaurant where he had proposed decades earlier. The pearls were lustrous and perfectly matched, each one selected by Robert himself from a jeweler who specialized in estate pieces with stories to tell. He had saved for 8 months to afford them, working extra weekend shifts at the construction company while Mary ran the bookstore and raised David. "These are for the woman who gave me everything," he had whispered as he clasped them around her neck, his calloused hands gentle against her skin. The pearls had caught the candlelight that night, glowing like tiny moons against her dark blue dress. For 27 years, those pearls had been Mary's most treasured possession, worn only on the most special occasions. David's high school graduation, her parents' anniversary celebrations, the bookstore's grand opening, and quiet date nights when Robert would take her dancing at the community center. After Robert's death, the necklace became her connection to their love story, a tangible reminder of a man who had seen her worth and celebrated it. She would sometimes hold the pearls while sitting alone in her apartment, feeling the smooth surfaces warm under her fingers and remembering Robert's voice telling her she was beautiful, valuable, irreplaceable. When Mary moved into David and Claire's house, she had carefully packed the necklace in its original velvet-lined box, wrapping it in tissue paper and placing it in the deepest corner of her suitcase. She never wore it during those 2 years of invisible living, sensing somehow that Claire would find a way to criticize even her most precious memories. The pearls stayed hidden like a secret treasure, waiting for an occasion that never came, waiting for a moment when Mary might feel worthy of wearing something so beautiful again. Sometimes late at night, she would take them out just to hold them, whispering apologies to Robert for letting herself become someone he wouldn't recognize. The necklace had been in her jewelry box on the guest room dresser the morning she left for her weekly grocery shopping trip, the same trip where she would return to find her life packed on the porch. Mary had developed a routine of running errands on Thursday mornings, partly to help with household tasks, but mostly to escape the suffocating atmosphere of being unwanted. She would spend hours at the grocery store, reading magazine covers and watching other customers interact with their families, wondering if she had imagined the warmth she once felt in her son's presence. Those Thursday morning escapes were the only time she felt like a person instead of a problem to be managed. As Mary sat on the porch swing reading the dismissive note, her mind immediately went to the jewelry box she couldn't see among her hastily packed belongings. Panic shot through her chest as she realized that her most precious possession, the physical embodiment of her marriage and Robert's love, might still be inside the house with people who had just thrown her away like garbage. The pearls represented everything she had been before becoming small and apologetic. She had been a wife, a business owner, a woman worthy of being treasured. Without those pearls, she feared she might forget that version of herself entirely, leaving nothing but the diminished woman who had learned to apologize for breathing too loudly in her own son's home. Mary's fingers shook as she dialed the number for Harrison and Associates, the law firm whose advertisement she had noticed months ago in the community newsletter she still received from her old Phoenix neighborhood. The receptionist's voice was professionally warm, but Mary found herself struggling to explain her situation without crying. "I need to speak to someone about getting my property back," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist scheduled her for the following afternoon with James Harrison himself, a detail that made Mary wonder if her case was more serious than she had realized, or if she sounded desperate enough to warrant immediate attention from the senior partner. The law office occupied the 3rd floor of a modern building in downtown Scottsdale, its glass walls offering a view of the desert mountains that had once comforted Mary during her bookstore days. James Harrison was younger than she expected, maybe 50, with kind eyes and the sort of patient manner that suggested he had helped many people navigate the aftermath of family betrayals. He offered her tea and waited while she collected herself enough to tell her story from the beginning. The bookstore sale, the financial rescue, the 2 years of shrinking herself to fit into spaces where she wasn't wanted, and finally, the porch full of her belongings and the missing pearl necklace. "Mrs. Chen," Harrison said gently, using her married name with a respect that she hadn't heard in months, "what they did is called constructive eviction, and it's illegal. Even if you weren't paying rent directly, your financial contributions to the household and the lack of proper notice make their actions legally questionable." Mary felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, hope, maybe, or the first whisper of righteous anger she had felt in 2 years. Harrison explained that they would start with a formal demand letter requesting return of her property, particularly items of significant monetary or sentimental value, like the pearl necklace she described in detail. The legal terminology felt foreign but empowering as Harrison outlined their strategy. They would document everything: the sale of her bookstore, the money transferred to David and Claire's accounts, the informal rental arrangement, and most importantly, the inventory of her possessions that had been removed from the house without her consent. Mary found herself sitting straighter in her chair, remembering what it felt like to be treated as someone whose problems mattered, whose voice deserved to be heard. Harrison's confidence was infectious, transforming her from a discarded woman into a client with rights worth protecting. As Mary left the law office that afternoon, clutching a business card and a manila folder containing the initial paperwork, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, the sense that she mattered enough to fight for. The elevator ride down seemed symbolic somehow, carrying her from the realm of legal possibilities back to the harsh reality of having nowhere to go and a family that had thrown her away. But now she had an advocate, someone who saw her situation as wrong rather than inevitable. The woman who had spent months apologizing for existing was beginning to remember that she had rights, dignity, and value that no one could simply pack up and leave on a porch. The extended stay America on Bell Road became Mary's temporary fortress, a generic but clean refuge where she could exist without apologizing for taking up space. The room smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and featured furniture bolted to the floor, but it was hers for as long as her savings could stretch. Mary had never lived in a hotel before, and the daily housekeeping service felt like a luxury after months of tiptoeing around Claire's cleaning schedules and criticism. She could leave her coffee cup on the nightstand, watch television at normal volume, and eat whatever she wanted without judgment about her heavy food choices or outdated eating habits. The first week passed in a strange suspension of reality, where Mary found herself walking through her days like someone recovering from surgery. She bought clothes at Target since most of her wardrobe was still in boxes somewhere, presumably in David and Claire's garage waiting for pickup arrangements that might never come. The simple act of choosing what to wear each morning felt revolutionary after 2 years of trying to dress invisibly, avoiding anything Claire might comment on as inappropriate for her age. Mary bought a bright purple sweater simply because she liked it, wearing it like armor against the voices in her head that had learned to criticize her choices before anyone else could. Harrison's office called with updates every few days, their professional tone a stark contrast to the silence from David's house. The demand letter had been delivered and received, but so far there was no response from David or Claire. Harrison assured Mary that this was normal, that people often needed time to consult their own legal counsel before responding to formal demands. But Mary knew her son well enough to recognize the pattern. David had always avoided difficult conversations by pretending they weren't happening, hoping problems would resolve themselves if ignored long enough. The trait that had seemed like gentle optimism in childhood now felt like cowardice in the face of his mother's abandonment. The hardest part wasn't the uncertainty about her belongings or even the legal proceedings, it was the complete silence from the family she had sacrificed everything to help. No phone call to check if she was safe, no text message asking where she was staying, no acknowledgement that a 69-year-old woman had been left to figure out her life alone after giving them everything. Mary found herself checking her phone obsessively, hoping for some sign that David remembered she was his mother, that 2 years of living together meant something more than an inconvenience they had finally discarded. The silence felt more violent than the original eviction, a deliberate erasure of her existence from their narrative. On the 7th night in the hotel, Mary stood at the window looking out at the parking lot full of other displaced people living in temporary spaces, and realized she had been holding her breath for 2 years. The woman who once commanded respect from authors and publishers, who had built a successful business from nothing, who had raised a son alone and done it with dignity, that woman was still inside her, just buried under layers of apology and accommodation. The pearls might be gone, her home might be sold, her family might have discarded her, but Mary Chen was beginning to remember who she had been before she learned to make herself small. The fight for her necklace was becoming something larger, a fight to reclaim the woman she had been before fear taught her to disappear. Harrison's call came on a Tuesday morning while Mary was eating breakfast at the hotel's Continental Breakfast Bar, watching other long-term residents navigate their temporary lives with the same careful politeness she had perfected at David's house. His voice carried a tension that made her stomach clench before he even delivered the news. "Mary, we have a problem with the necklace," he said, and she could hear papers shuffling in the background. Her knuckles went white around the phone as he explained that David and Claire's attorney had responded to their demand letter with a counterclaim that felt like a physical blow to her chest. They were denying that the pearl necklace had ever belonged to Mary, claiming instead that it was a family heirloom that had always been Claire's property, inherited from her own grandmother and merely stored in Mary's room for safekeeping. The audacity of the lie took Mary's breath away, but Harrison's next words were even worse. Claire had provided photographs of herself wearing the necklace at various family events over the past year, events Mary barely remembered because she had been excluded from most family celebrations during her time as their invisible houseguest. The photographs showed Claire at holiday parties, work events, and dinner dates, Mary's most precious possession glowing around the neck of the woman who had made her feel worthless. Mary's hands trembled as she tried to process the magnitude of the betrayal. While she had been hiding the necklace away, afraid that wearing it might invite Claire's criticism, her daughter-in-law had been stealing it for special occasions, treating Mary's most sacred possession like a costume jewelry accessory she could borrow without permission. The violation felt more intimate than the eviction, more personal than being thrown away. This was theft of her memories, her marriage, her connection to Robert's love. Claire hadn't just taken pearls, she had stolen pieces of Mary's soul and worn them like trophies. Harrison's voice became harder as he outlined their legal options, explaining that proving ownership would require documentation, receipts, insurance records, or witness testimony about the necklace's history. Mary felt the familiar panic of someone whose quiet life hadn't been documented in the ways that courts required. Robert had bought the necklace with cash from a small jeweler who had probably been out of business for years, and most of the people who had seen her wear it were either dead or distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in decades. The very privacy and simplicity that had made her marriage beautiful now worked against her in a system that valued paperwork over truth. But as Mary sat in that hotel breakfast area, surrounded by the sounds of other people starting their days, something cold and determined settled in her chest. Claire had made a critical error in her elaborate lie. She had underestimated the quiet woman she had spent 2 years dismissing. Mary might have learned to be invisible, but she had also learned to observe, to remember details, to notice the small things that louder people missed. The woman who had once cataloged thousands of books and remembered every customer's preferences was about to apply those same skills to destroying the fiction that her family had built around her discarded life. The fight for the pearls was becoming a war for the truth, and Mary was done being polite. Mary spent 3 days at the Phoenix Public Library, hunted through old files like a detective building a case that could restore her identity. Her marriage certificate was easy to find in the records department, and the city hall clerk helped her locate the business license for Chapters and Charm, proving her financial independence and the timeline of her bookstore sale. But the real breakthrough came when she remembered Mrs. Rodriguez, her former customer who had been a wedding photographer for 40 years and had taken pictures at many of the community events where Mary wore her pearls. Mrs. Rodriguez still lived in the same house near Mary's old bookstore, and her memory was sharp as ever. "Of course I remember those beautiful pearls," Mrs. Rodriguez said, pulling out photo albums that documented 20 years of community life. "Robert was so proud when he gave them to you. He told everyone at the anniversary party that he'd been saving for months." The photographs were perfect evidence. Mary wearing the necklace at the bookstore's 10th anniversary celebration, at the community center's Christmas dance, at the library fundraiser where she had volunteered for years. In every picture, the pearls caught the light like tiny stars against Mary's dark dresses, and her face glowed with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew she was loved. Harrison was delighted with the evidence, but Mary's research had uncovered something even more valuable than photographs, a pattern of behavior that painted Claire's character in devastating detail. Mary had kept meticulous records of her financial contributions to David's household, including receipts for groceries, utilities, and household items she had purchased during her 2-year stay. The records showed a woman who had given thousands of dollars to a family that had treated her like a burden, and they created a timeline that contradicted Claire's claims about the necklace being a family heirloom. The most damaging evidence came from Mary's careful memory of conversations and incidents that she had dismissed as minor cruelties at the time. Claire's comments about Mary's flashy jewelry, her suggestions that older women shouldn't wear attention-getting accessories, her insistence that Mary keep her personal items contained to the guest room, all of it took on sinister meaning when viewed as part of a systematic campaign to isolate Mary from her own possessions. Harrison dictated while Mary recounted every slight, every criticism, every moment when Claire had made her feel ashamed of the things that connected her to her former life. The transformation in Mary was visible even to strangers. The hotel desk clerk commented on how much more confident she seemed, how she stood straighter and spoke with authority when discussing her daily plans. The woman who had learned to apologize for existing was becoming someone who demanded accountability, who refused to accept lies as truth. Mary's quiet rage was crystallizing into something powerful and focused, fueled by the realization that her family's betrayal wasn't accidental or thoughtless, it was calculated and cruel. The fight for the pearls had become a fight for justice, and Mary was discovering that she had been underestimated by people who mistook kindness for weakness. The mediation session took place in a sterile conference room at Harrison's law firm, with fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows across the polished table where Mary's future would be decided. David arrived looking older than his 42 years, his shoulders hunched with the weight of shame he couldn't quite acknowledge, while Claire swept in wearing a navy blue suit that screamed expensive lawyer fees they couldn't afford. Mary's pearl necklace gleamed around Claire's neck like a declaration of war, the sight hitting Mary like a physical blow that left her momentarily breathless. The mediator, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Wells, set ground rules in a voice that suggested she had refereed countless family disasters. Harrison opened with a methodical presentation of evidence that built Mary's case like a prosecutor proving premeditated theft. The photographs from Mrs. Rodriguez showed Mary wearing the necklace at community events spanning 2 decades, each image time-stamped and authenticated. Bank records proved Mary's financial contributions to the household, contradicting any claim that she had been a dependent rather than a provider. The documentation was overwhelming, but Mary watched David's face throughout the presentation, searching for some sign of the boy who used to beg her for bedtime stories and promise he would always take care of his mommy. Claire's attorney, a sharp-faced young man who looked like he charged by the word, attempted to discredit Mary's evidence with a confidence that crumbled under Harrison's cross-examination. The story about the necklace being a family heirloom fell apart when they couldn't produce any documentation, insurance records, or even photographs of Claire's supposed grandmother wearing similar pearls. Claire's face grew red as her lies were exposed systematically, each contradiction making her seem smaller and more desperate. When the mediator asked directly about the photographs showing Claire wearing the necklace while Mary lived in their house, the silence stretched like a held breath. "I borrowed it sometimes," Claire finally admitted, her voice tight with fury at being cornered. "Mary never wore it anyway. She kept everything locked away like she was saving it for someone special, but she never had anywhere special to go." The cruelty of the words hung in the air like poison, revealing the depth of Claire's contempt for the woman who had sacrificed everything to help them. David's face went white as he realized what his wife had done, what he had enabled through his willful blindness. Mary felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, which had already shattered, but the last chain binding her to the hope that her family might still love her. Mary stood slowly, her voice steady despite the earthquake of emotions threatening to destroy her composure. "You're right, Claire," she said, meeting her daughter-in-law's shocked gaze. "I didn't have anywhere special to go because you made sure I knew I wasn't welcome anywhere in your world. But those pearls weren't yours to borrow, and that house wasn't yours to throw me out of, and my son wasn't yours to turn against his own mother." The words came out clear and strong, each one carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of someone who had finally found her voice after 2 years of forced silence. The woman who had disappeared was returning, and she was done apologizing for taking up space in the world. 6 months later, Mary stood in the lobby of her new apartment building in downtown Phoenix, signing for a delivery that would complete the final chapter of her legal battle with David and Claire. The envelope contained a cashier's check for $68,000, the full amount of her bookstore sale money that had helped with their mortgage, plus interest and legal fees as ordered by the judge who had found their treatment of Mary to be unconscionable and legally actionable. The pearl necklace had been returned 3 months earlier, along with all of her belongings and a court order requiring David and Claire to stay away from her unless she initiated contact. The apartment was small but perfect, with large windows that flooded the space with natural light and a view of the mountains that reminded Mary of the desert mornings she used to love before she learned to make herself invisible. She had furnished it slowly and deliberately, choosing pieces that made her happy rather than trying to fit into someone else's vision of appropriate. The bright purple sweater hung in a closet full of clothes she had chosen for herself, colors and styles that reflected the woman she was becoming rather than the ghost she had been forced to be. Mary had used part of her settlement money to start a small online bookstore specializing in rare and out-of-print novels, combining her love of literature with her hard-won knowledge of human nature. The business was already thriving, with customers who appreciated her careful curation and personal recommendations. She wore her pearl necklace to the computer every morning, Robert's gift catching the sunlight as she typed descriptions of books that deserved to find readers who would treasure them. The necklace had become more than a memory. It was a symbol of her refusal to let anyone steal her worth ever again. David had called once, 3 weeks after the court ruling, his voice thick with tears and apologies that came too late to matter. Mary had listened quietly as he tried to explain how Claire's jealousy had poisoned his judgment, how he had been afraid of losing his wife if he defended his mother, how he realized too late that he had already lost something more precious. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom," he had whispered, but Mary's response was calm and final. "Some things can't be fixed, David. They can only be survived." She had hung up the phone and never answered his calls again. The woman who sat in her bright apartment 6 months later, planning book recommendations and corresponding with customers who valued her expertise, bore little resemblance to the ghost who had haunted David's guest room. Mary had learned that love shouldn't require you to disappear, that family doesn't mean accepting cruelty, that sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation is walking away from people who can't see your worth. She touched the pearls around her neck each morning, feeling Robert's love and her own hard-won strength, knowing that she had finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. The woman who had almost let herself be erased had chosen instead to write a new chapter, one where she was the hero of her own story rather than a supporting character in someone else's life. If Mary's story moved you, drop a comment below about a time you had to stand up for yourself or someone you love. Sometimes we all need to remember that we're worth fighting for. And don't forget to share this story with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your worth.